Hello, my delicious co-creators. Lilu here. I'm in beautiful Sedona. I'm at the Bio-Cybernaut Institute, and we're going to have a very special conversation. This is an important topic. We're going to talk about the brain makeover, increasing our alpha wave. And the man sitting next to me, Dr. Hart, actually claims that this technology, this technique can remove your anxiety, your stress, even suicidal thoughts, migraines. I mean, there's so many discoveries we're going to speak about. You have done over 30 years of research. You went to the University Carnegie, prestigious university here, and you have a doctorate in physics and in psychology, right?
PhD is only in psychology.
Yes.
The physics is a bachelor's degree.
Nice. Well, you have done extensive research on the brain waves and how to really, I guess, can we say if we control our brain, we have this amazing life? Is there an equation there?
You control your brain, you can control pretty much anything about your life.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Where is the heart in all of this?
Well, the brain is linked to the heart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the more we would increase our brain capacities, our life can expand, our heart has more space to
In order to raise your alpha waves, you have to open your heart.
Yeah. Yes. So we're going to get into all of this and what are actually those different brain waves and why is it important and how you came across it. But also we're going to do a second part on the forgiveness. There's a huge forgiveness process here. Going on to be able to heal some aspect of ourselves that are holding us back from living this full life. I don't know if you've seen the movie Lucy by Luc Besson.
I have. Wonderful movie. I loved it.
I think it's fascinating. And at some point they say how we're only using as human beings 10% and the dolphins might be using 20%. And what if we would use 100% of our brain capacity? In that movie, they're not able to answer that question. Do you have a hint about that? Can we use actually 100% of our capacity? How much are we using right now, most of us?
Well, let's just say more is better.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's hard to say, it's hard to give the percentage on how much we're using?
Yeah. Because how would you measure it?
Yeah.
Who has done 100% that you can compare to?
Yeah.
I'd like to meet the person.
Well, so let's talk about, you went to India, you went to study with some Zen master and actually see these guys have been meditating for years and years and years. And what happened there for you? I mean, you started measuring their brain waves and noticed that actually in 7 days, from my understanding, in 7 days in your training, you can reach those 40 years of meditation.
In Zen, it takes 21 to 40 years to become advanced.
Wow.
That's a rating that's given by Zen masters. And in one study in Japan, in both the Soto and the Rinzai branches of Zen, they studied monks who were practicing Zen meditation. And nobody was rated advanced who had less than 21 years of practice. So the brainwave patterns of beginners, alpha increases at the back of the head. Intermediate Zen, it increases the back of the head and spreads forward. And in the advanced, it does those two things, plus the frequency of the alpha slows a little, and then theta waves emerge at the frontal locations. And that exact pattern is produced in just 7 days in the Bio-Cybernaut Alpha 1 training.
Yeah, so there's really something about technology.
Speeds things up.
Yeah, it does. How are you able to measure that? How were you able to measure how effective they were and how effective you're here in the Institute with people?
Well, the study was done in Japan by Kasamatsu and Hirai, pillars of the Japanese scientific community. And they used EEG equipment, not feedback, just passive recording. And they went to the Zen masters, requested permission to rate the Zen master rated the monks, and then they measured the brainwaves while they were sitting in meditation. And that's how they discovered this. And they revealed the pattern, and then I looked at the pattern of our trainees, and in 1 week they were developing that same pattern. I was astonished, delighted, but also astonished.
So tell us what happens in the brain when we meditate. In general, just in general?
Well, in a very simple way, you're trying to tune in to a very subtle internal signal. The alpha waves are generated in the thalamus. There are pacemaker cells there, and they run 24/7. And they project to the surface of the brain, always urging the brain, be an alpha, be an alpha. But if you're busy or stressed, you ignore that subtle inner voice. And so meditation consists of quieting the mind, going to a quiet place, a meditation room, a forest, a cave, and tuning inward to that subtle voice. Well, we also put people in a quiet room or chamber, but then we reach in with the technology and we pick up the signal and we amplify it about 100,000 times. So it's easier for people to tune in to their alpha waves.
And once we start kicking in some alphas, there's no way to return back to where it was. Meaning, if we, through meditation or through your technique, the brain start liking it,
yes.
liking it a lot. So do you keep that level, or there is a certain ongoing training that we need to do?
Well, when I measured the IQ increases
Yeah.
as a result of the training, the boost was stable at least a year out. I didn't measure beyond that. At one point, I did a $250,000 federal grant, working with people who were from 60 up into their 80s, because this also reverses aging in the brain. And I measured people before and after the training with personality tests, and then 6 months later to see, how much did it retain. They were actually better at 6 months than they were immediately after. And we remeasured them at 12 months, and they were better still. So scientifically, I can't say anything about what happens beyond a year, but at least up to a year, people are still getting more benefits from the training.
I guess you have spent hours and hours and years, 30 years, from my understanding, of researching, putting the technology together, creating programs to measure those brain waves. How all this has unfolded for you, because it's quite remarkable work that you put together here.
I was guided to do this by an experience that happened to me in Joe Camilla's lab. I volunteered as a research subject, had 3 days of training, about an hour a day, one electrode, one tone, one score, and it was so fascinating. I loved it. I wanted more. I went back on the 4th day, but was disappointed that they weren't doing any studies. But Dr. Camilla had a girlfriend who worked in the lab, Joanne Gardner, and so I asked her if she would put a couple electrodes on me, put me in the chamber so I could play, and she happily did that. Then she went upstairs, got involved with other things, later went to lunch, forgot I was there.
Yeah.
And that was when I popped. And
What do you mean pop?
Well, I had out-of-body experience. Now, mind you, when I went in there, I was a physics major,
Yeah.
Protestant fundamentalist. I had never been drunk or high in any way. And so I didn't know anything about meditation or altered states. And so all of a sudden I'm having out-of-body experience, ego disintegration, contact with discorporate entities. I mean, it was a lot for a physics major.
Yeah, that's a lot to integrate.
Yeah.
You didn't went totally nuts after that?
Oh, no,
Go
it
nuts.
was fascinating. And I was like a bird flying in a limitless heaven. It was really, really amazing. And so that experience...
That was your pool of alpha. That's what you call swimming in the infinite pool of alpha.
I was swimming in the infinite... Ooh, goosebumps, yes. Oh, yes.
He's pumping the alpha right now.
So good. Yeah.
He's in there.
You
Can you
evoked
feel it?
And so initially, all I wanted to do was tell people about this. But then when I went back, left San Francisco at the end of the summer and went back and registered for psychology grad school, I met with one of my professors, told him about the experience, and he said, well, we can do that here. And all of a sudden, it went from something really cool that had happened to me to a vocation.
Yeah.
And so this sustained me through dark periods where most of the people in America stopped doing brainwave training. And
Why? Was there something challenging people? Was there some controversial things
well,
that
there
happened?
was. And I haven't shared that story really publicly with anyone, but I'll share it with you. When I spoke at the first meeting of the Society for the Study of Neuronal Regulation, I presented 5 papers, I think it was 1994. One of the people there, Adam Crane, said he had to take me to dinner. And he told me this story at dinner. He said he was trying to take, in 1972, a small brainwave feedback company public.
Okay.
And he was running into brick walls. 2 underwriting firms had spent $50,000 of their own money and they were going nowhere. He was on his 3rd firm in the federal building in San Francisco talking to an SEC examiner and getting nowhere. And so he reached out with, I think, his delta waves, and he said, isn't there something we could do? So the guy said, let me take you to lunch. And he said, a secret executive order has gone out from the Nixon White House that brainwave feedback should be suppressed. Don't put any of your own money into it because it's not going anywhere. And in fact, 1973, 1974, brainwave feedback stopped being done all across America. There were only two people that continued doing it, as far as I know, me and Elmer Green, who was working with theta waves at the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas. Everybody else stopped, and that stopped.
Why? Because they had a threat?
Well, they were name brand authors doing studies with one subject where they would train people for 8 minutes and then conclude grandly that people couldn't learn. So, you know, professors or assistant professors wanting to have a good career, they're not going to research something where the experts are saying it doesn't work. And so people stopped doing it. They continued to do biofeedback from here down, temperature feedback, muscle feedback, heart rate feedback, but they stopped doing brainwave feedback. And that continued from 1972 until 1989 when the genie got out of the bottle again. And so then things started up. And in 2005, I was training in California a former Army intelligence officer who had done the Alpha 1 training with me in 1983. And I told him this story. He said, oh, I think I know who that would have been. It would have been a man named Ira Berg, who was a high-ranking CIA official who was involved in giving LSD to Army people. And when a high-ranking officer went out of a hotel upper floor, you know, and was killed, there were congressional investigations. Ira Berg had to leave the CIA. And so brainwave feedback started up again. And so there was a time where it was a dark period. And there wasn't support. And I was doing it, though, because I knew. I knew.
You've established it pretty well. I mean, scientifically, you have had many peer reviews. Tell us about that, because that's essential here. I mean, we're talking about the brain, and you have to make a solid case. And tell us about that, and what are really the benefits and what is at the heart of that research to confirm that it really has an effect, because there must be a strong effect for some government entities to start wanting this to not happen.
Exactly. I think it wakes people up.
Wakes people up.
Yeah.
They start thinking.
Smart
thinking, and that's your book, actually, The Art of Smart Thinking. So you start to think smartly. So how did you put this research together?
Well, my doctoral dissertation research was on the topic of anxiety. From reading the literature, I had discovered that low alpha was characteristic of high anxiety people. And so I wanted to see if I could train high anxiety people to have more alpha, if their anxiety would go down. And I was able to demonstrate that. And so I could take people at the extremes of anxiety, and 7 days later they'd be in the middle of or be below average in anxiety. And so this result made it to publication in Science magazine, which is one of the two top general science magazines, along with the British journal Nature. And July 7th, 1978, the paper was published documenting to the highest level of peer review that when high anxiety people increase their alpha, they become low anxiety. Now this is radical. It's revolutionary, because most of psychiatry believed at the time that personality was stable over the adult lifespan. You couldn't change it. But I was seeing, for example, multiple personalities, where when Sarah would click into Jane or Bill, in those moments there would be massive and profound changes in the brainwaves. Others were finding that. So when I found that when people voluntarily with feedback could change their brainwaves, they would change their personalities. More recently, I published in November of 2012 in a peer-reviewed medical journal, Advances in Mind-Body Medicine. So I sent the paper in. We were working with Canadian Aboriginals who are severely traumatized, a lot of sexual abuse, the residential school system, things like that. And so they we measured personality before and after. They were so profoundly healed that we sent the results in to this medical journal, and the editor, Dr. Andrew Campbell, then asked to see the raw data. So we sent the raw data. And he called up about a week later and he said, I want to do this training. And I go, Dr. Campbell, what's happening? He said, well, as editor of 2 medical journals, I see hundreds of papers cross my desk every week. The best of them help a small segment of the population on a few of the measures. You're helping everybody. and on all the measures. These are not baby steps, these are elephant steps. So I would like to experience this training. So he came and did the training.
Yeah. So it has a psychiatrical impact, right? I mean, this is, you're even saying this might be the future of psychiatry.
Well, I prefer to call it education.
Education.
When people learn about their personalities and their moods and their brainwaves, they find that they're linked.
Yeah.
And so when they can change their brainwaves, they can change their moods and they can change their personalities.
Yeah.
But I prefer to call it education.
Yeah. How come there are some of us that are so split in their personality, and then all of a sudden because of that they realign and they're just themselves again and are comfortable with who they are?
Trauma. When Drunvalo Melchizedek trained did the Alpha 1 training in May of 2007, afterwards he said that 95% of all the people who do his teachings don't get the fullness of them. And he said it's always because of emotional trauma. And he added that he's never found anything as powerful as the Biocybernaut training in healing and getting rid of emotional trauma. And so if you have trauma, you're split.
If we're a human being, we have trauma.
Yes.
All of us.
If you have parents, you have issues.
Yeah. Can you tell us about the studies you have done and the research on the people that have migraines?
Oh, sure.
Because this seems to work on so many different things,
Yes.
you know, strokes, even people with strokes. But migraines here as
and
well?
we can talk about stroke too.
Yeah.
In the mid-'80s, I ran a migraine clinic within the training center. And I worked only with the most extreme forms of migraines. People who would have 2 or 3 per month, 5 to 7 day migraines where they couldn't get out of bed. Very serious cases. And we helped all of them. There were 11 women and 1 man. More migraineurs are women. And so migraineurs tend to have very strict parents, perfectionists. And so the children would be, very, very well behaved. But what I found in every one of these 12 cases was that between 7 and 9 years old, the children started to have spontaneous Kundalini awakenings. And this formerly well-behaved child is now bouncing around the room like a basketball, freaking out their parents who punish severely and withdraw love. Children will do anything to, make that stop. And the only thing strong enough to stop the Kundalini was they learned how to bring on a migraine. And then, of course, they get a little older and then they can't stop it. And so every single one of them was able to get rid of their migraines. Now, they did have to, avoid cheese and red wine and not get chilled and things like that. But if they did that, they didn't have migraines again.
Let's go into the brain waves, because there's different kind of brain waves, and there is even subcategories of brain waves, aren't they?
Yes.
Tell us what are they, and yes, just so that we know there are different names and the hertz level.
Well, one metaphor would be to think of a prism with a shaft of sunlight coming through, and then you see the spectrum. If you take the shaft of sunlight and replace it with a channel of brainwaves and pass it through the electronic equivalent of a prism, then you'll get the spectrum. And so the slowest brainwaves are delta. That would be like the red. Then the next fastest is theta. The next fastest is alpha, the next fastest is beta, and the fastest brainwaves are gamma. And there are subbands within there, like low delta and fast delta are really different.
Very different,
Very
right?
different,
Because
yeah.
I heard even in reading your book, there's the mystical theta.
Yes, exactly.
Very different than the drowsiness.
Well, right. Drowsy theta looks like little pointy croquet wickets, whereas mystical theta looks like slow down alpha comes in spindles. Birds come in flocks, lions come in prides, and alpha and mystical theta come in spindles, which are little wave packets traveling together.
Yeah. And we can awaken that. Like we
Yes.
can awaken. So most of us actually don't have an alpha really running or going on.
The way, well, not nearly as much as you could have.
Yeah, exactly.
You saw how all of a sudden in the second day, one of your alpha channels just exploded with more power and more strength. People live their lives under a lot of stress.
Yeah.
They don't get enough sleep. They eat onions and garlic, which suppress their alpha brain waves.
Yeah, no, I'm laughing, but you're very serious about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Extremely.
Yeah.
This really lowers our alpha waves.
And makes the mind agitated. I first ran into this when I started to do the Yogananda correspondence lessons. And he said, get rid of onions and garlic because they agitate the mind. They promote a rajasic temperament. And Well, you saw in your own brainwaves how as you did more training, the bursts would become longer and steadier. Well, if you have an agitated mind, it breaks the bursts up and they're shorter. And in the advanced Zen, the bursts can go 10 or 20 seconds without a break.
Yeah. And this alpha state is really a state, I mean, I experience it as something where everything is like it's quite powerful, like all of a sudden you're connected to everything and you have this knowing, kind of an all-knowing. I mean, it's a very powerful experience, though it seems to slip away. Like it happens to us, and at the same time we're creating it. Are we totally in control of this? Can we really be 100% in control with alpha waves?
Well, I like to talk about two different minds. The 20,000 bit per second conscious processor and the 4 billion bit per second unconscious processor. And the conscious processor is not very good at doing alpha. You know, it's into trying and will and things like that. And alpha more comes when you allow, when you open your heart, and when you surrender. And so these are important things to do. But then, when you do that, then in a non-directive way, you can in fact control your alpha. I sometimes distinguish between the active will and the passive volition.
Volition, what is volition?
Well, volition is a word like will, but it's much gentler. And it doesn't have as much ego in it.
Yeah, how come the ego is really threatened by that?
Well, the ego.
And what is for you the ego?
Okay. Well, it's interesting. Freud discovered the ego, and in doing the work here, particularly with the computerized mood scales, I've seen many, many faces of ego. Now, at one point, I was reading the Zen ox herding stories, and there I learned about what they discovered were the 5 hindrances, which are means that ego uses to stay in control. They're doubt, drowsiness, distractibility and worry, aversion and any form of ill will, and boredom. Now, to that list, I've added forgetfulness. And so these are the ways that ego uses to be in control. Now, that's pretty much what it wants. It wants to be in control. But when you go into an ecstatic state or higher consciousness, you need to surrender the ego. Well, it's going to fight bloody murder against any loss of control of you.
And the ego is created through those traumatic experiences. I mean, or it's reinforced.
Well, certainly reinforced. And if you have a trauma, the ego can push that button and then you go into, the experience of the trauma. Let's say, well, let me give you an example. There was a more than 80-year-old monk, very close to the Dalai Lama, who had been instructed by the Dalai Lama to be open about his practice. So he went to a brainwave measuring place, I think in Dharamsala, and he's sitting there in the chamber, electrodes on his head. Now, in that session, he came up on one of the major attainment levels in Buddhism. There's over 150 attainment levels. And in this state, he was highly telepathic, and the brainwaves, the alpha, got really huge. And so the technicians were calling the doctor, oh, wow, come look, look, look. And he's in the chamber, aware that the scientists had cognized him as an object of significant scientific interest, and his ego took pride in that. And it was like it took marbles and threw it under his feet, and he tripped and failed to go across to that higher level. And so ego is an opportunistic predator, and it'll always be there to trip you up if you're about to go into a more egoless state.
Yeah, though it serves its purpose, I guess. This is because of ego that we kind of have a drive, no? Or can we have a drive? This actually alpha waves raises our drive.
Well, again,
in a good way.
you can have the active will, or you can have the passive volition. And for some things, active will is okay. But, for the highest levels of human creativity, you can't want too much. You have to allow. The process of creativity has 4 stages. You do your homework, you find out the problems, then you incubate, then you have the illumination, the experience, the eureka, I found it, both of those are high alpha, and then you go back and verify. But in the eureka, I found it, you have to surrender. You have to let go. And then the alpha brings you the answer.
You're claiming that it raises by 50% the creativity levels.
Yes.
Actually, some Harvard, is it graduate?
Stanford Research Institute scientists.
Yeah. That's what they said. Like it raised their own levels of 50%.
We used the alternate uses test of creativity. We gave it to them before and after the alpha training. Afterwards, the average increase was 50%.
That's a lot.
Huge. I mean, these are people where creativity is their bread and butter.
Yeah.
Some of them solve problems in the chamber that they'd been stumped by for 2 years.
Wow. Where does that happen? Where this creativity is ignited in the brain? I mean, can you tell us about the different areas of the brain? And
Well, alpha is beneficial at any area of the brain. Alpha increases anywhere on the head will reduce anxiety. But there are some specific sites, like for example, left central, alpha increases there will reduce paranoia and increase trust. And in the Trust in the Heart Sutra of the third Chinese patriarch of Zen, Sengstand writes, the trusting mind is one with the non-dual. And so to experience non-dualism, you have to go into trust, which means big increase in your C3 alpha.
what are the other areas?
Well, at the back of the head,
Yeah.
I've demonstrated that occipital alpha increases will reduce schizophrenia and psychasthenia. And you can reduce depression by increasing in the frontal areas.
And the writer's block, can you tell us about your writer's block story?
Yeah. We had a famous author in training. He'd written 16 books and won international acclaim. And he was struggling. Couldn't write, 2.5 years he's struggling, couldn't write his 17th book. And he was darkly talking about suicide because for him, to write was to live, and if he couldn't write, well, why to live? So he came in to the training, and what I noticed right away on the first day was that his left occipital alpha, for a right-hander, this is normally going to be your second biggest channel. It was a distant last. It was below even the temporals, which are called the poor stepchildren of the alpha world. And so I said to him at the end of the day, I said, well, I know why you're in writer's block. And all of a sudden I really had his attention because that was what he wanted to do, was regain his ability to write. And I said, yeah, your left occipital alpha, which is the lowest pitch tone, it's the speaker to your left rear. If you can raise the alpha there, your writer's block will go away. So he diligently worked on that on day 2 of this 7-day training.
You mean we can work on a particular area?
Oh yeah, because there are different tones, bum, 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 in the alpha 1. And on the screen, which shows your scores, that would be the lower left score. So he could know, he could try something and see if it helped. Try something else, if it didn't help, then he'd go back to the first thing. And gradually, he brought it up pretty well on the second day. And on the third day, it exploded into much higher alpha. It was now number 2, like it would normally be in most people. And the muse of all writers appeared to him. And she was downloading into him the details of this novel that he'd been unable to write. And he always carried a little tape recorder. So he'd go into alpha and get a download, and then take the tape recorder and talk into it, and then go back and get some more alpha, and then talk into the tape recorder. And by the end of that third day, his book was completely written. Now, that was day 3 of the 7-day training. He'd gotten more than he'd expected, more than he thought possible. Well, so we went into playing Sherlock Holmes. Like, how did this famous writer get into writer's block? And so it was fascinating. I quizzed him. The 16 books were written in a beautiful A-frame house in the redwoods above Los Angeles. But he put himself kind of in writer's prison. He would go upstairs to his beautiful, writing area at 9 o'clock. His wife would bring up lunch, but wouldn't talk, just put the lunch down. His wife would not allow phone calls or visits, not even from his children, but between 9 and 6. And so in that sort of writer's prison, he'd written these 16 books. Then, having won international acclaim, he moved down to Malibu. And now he's living next to the glitterati and the Hollywood stars, and all of them want him to come to their parties. Well, he looks at them as, airheads, pretty faces with no, intellect. He's an intellect. And so he doesn't want to go to their parties. But his wife wants to go, and his ego wants to go, because they fawn over him. And so he wants to stay home and write. Well, ego figured out that if it could shut off blood flow to this one area of the brain, he couldn't write. He wouldn't have logical, analytical, or verbal creativity. And so his ego shut that down, so then we'd be vulnerable to his wife's entreaties to go to the parties. Now, when he learned that, we solved this together, he actually went into an existential crisis because he had been a devotee of Ayn Rand and kind of had put his ego where most people would put God. And when he found out that his ego didn't care a hoot for his writings, he was devastated for a while. It took a while to work through that.
Wow, it's a great story. When you go in the chamber, you place electrodes, and then we're here in actually the place where not the magic happens, because the magic happens in the chamber.
Yes.
But tell us, how is it all linked? What are the kind of equipment that you have? Tell us a little bit on the technical aspect. What's going on?
Okay, we put electrodes on people's heads,
Yeah.
gather them together, plug them into a little head box so they're mobile, they can walk around. When they go into the chamber, the head box is plugged into a preamplifier. The brainwaves are so tiny, just a few millionths of a volt, that they can't even come out of the chamber unless they get an initial boost. So that preamp is on the wall right behind them. So then they go to the main amplifier, and then the main amplifier makes the signals bigger, does the spectral decomposition to break down the brainwaves into different frequencies, and goes down into the concrete slab through a pipe, comes into the control room, and comes up, and then goes into the computers, which then start to read the brainwaves. And we also run the brainwaves on polygraphs so we can actually see them moment by moment. So if somebody has tension in their jaw or they're wiggling, you know, we can coach them how to be better sit still. Or if an electrode pops off, we see it, we can go fix it.
Yeah.
And then the computers feed back to the people musical sounds that get louder when the alpha waves or the theta waves, if it's a theta training, when they get bigger. And so each site has a different tone. Bum, 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 bum. And so people know from pitch cues and spatial cues where the alpha is increasing on their head.
Yeah, so you hear those tones going higher when you're in higher alpha, when you're generating more alpha.
Yeah.
But those